other news, for the first time in history, the United Nations General Assembly has established a permanent commission of inquiry into one of its member states. As Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem, that member state is Israel.
The unprecedented UN decision puts Israel under almost perpetual investigation, covering sovereign Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza.
Well, I'm not aware of a commission of inquiry at the Human Rights Council that has been unlimited.
Hillel Neuer, head of UN Watch, says the idea for the commission started during Israel's war with Hamas last May.
You have the UN dedicating millions of dollars to targeting one single country, Israel. And keep in mind, this is not something to support peace, human rights, or justice. This is something to empower Hamas. We've seen it before. Hamas is the first supporter of these commissions of inquiry.
After the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, the UN held an urgent session, but declined to adopt a commission of inquiry into the Taliban's human rights abuses affecting hundreds of thousands of Afghans. This commission is one of a kind.
It is unlimited in its scope. It has budgeted for millions of dollars. It's unique in that regard. It is going to look both at the hostilities that happened in May, but also at so-called systematic discrimination, which we know for certain, I would say, that they intend to be accusing Israel of the blood libel of apartheid, to accuse Israel alone of being a racist state.
Neuer believes those appointed to the commission expose its bias.
The chair of the inquiry is Navi Pillay. She was the former UN human rights chief. She has said that Israel treats international law with, quote, perpetual disdain. She has also accused Israel of being an apartheid state. So she's meant to be the impartial chair of this inquiry. It's a farce.
The commission must submit a report each year to the Human Rights Council and General Assembly. While the U.S. voted against the resolution, the Biden administration has rejoined the Human Rights Council after the Trump administration pulled out. Neuer says the U.S. has an opportunity.
We hope that they will call out the absurdity of members on the council like Cuba, China, Russia, Venezuela. Most of these countries have never had a single investigation or inquiry. That's wrong. The U.S. needs to take leadership. We need to press our representatives, our presidents, our secretaries of state to speak out and stand up for the right thing.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, let's go back in history. Just 7 years ago, back in 2014, 100 congressmen signed a letter, an open letter, to the United Nations Human Rights Council. The head of that council, Navi Pillay, is now the current head of this brand new organization. And it's a permanent organization from the UN whose sole purpose is to investigate Israel's first time in the history of the UN this has happened. But when we look back 7 years ago as to what she did when she was on the Human Rights Council and head of that, the Congress of the United States got so upset they sent this open letter. The United Nations Human Rights Council simply cannot be taken seriously as a human rights organization when it establishes a commission of inquiry to unjustly probe alleged war crimes and violations of international law by the nation defending its citizens from rocket attacks and terror tunnels, rather than the terrorist group whose depravity makes a policy of using its citizens as human shields while its terror commanders flee to fortified bunkers. While we are saddened by the tragic loss of innocent life on both sides of this conflict, it is Hamas, a United States and European Union designated foreign terrorist organization, that has refused to de-escalate this conflict by agreeing to internationally backed ceasefires and continuing to indiscriminately launch rocket attacks at Israeli civilian population centers. So that's the head of the commission. We already know how it's going to be prejudged. We already know how it's going to play out. Congress has already acted, and they need to act again because the UN doesn't seem to want to stop this. I'll give the UN a target. If you want to look at discrimination in Israel, go right at the Palestinian Authority. Go right at Hamas. In Hamas-controlled territory, there is no freedom of speech. There is no freedom of assembly. There is no freedom of religion. You don't get to speak up against the government. You don't get to dissent. You don't get to say there's a better way. Within the Palestinian Authority, there is open racial and religious discrimination. You cannot be Jewish in the Palestinian Authority. If you're a Palestinian and you sell land to a Jewish person, you suffer the death penalty. These are incredible things, and the UN is absolutely silent on it. So more than just the rocket attacks being the cause of the current conflicts in Gaza, we have to look at the underlying ideology. The greatest persecutor of the Palestinian people is the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. Keep that in mind, and that is the real trouble here. It's the ideology of the leadership. Why hasn't Abbas stood for elections? Why hasn't Hamas had open elections? These are troubling things, but it doesn't seem to trouble the